As you might remember, Pixar's WALL-E picks up in the year 2805. That's not only 783 years away from our time, 2022, but also 700 years away from when humans allegedly left Earth, which is what the years listed for each captain of the Axiom has led us to believe. This is strange when you consider the fact that we learned the Axiom and its crew were only supposed to be in space for 5 years. That's literally a fraction of the amount of time that humanity ended up floating around in space. And I think we can be fairly certain that the decision to stay in space didn't come from the captains, though they might have thought it was their idea. As we found out later in the film, the Axiom is really controlled by a robot who, let's just say, is lacking in the emotions department. Even though the captains were the ones supposedly making all the decisions, they were really all being made off of data presented by this unemotional robot. Data that was specifically making the humans do what the robot thought was best. Which begs the question, why would the ship want the humans to stay in space for 695 years more than their initial plan? Better yet, how in the world did the Axiom have enough food to have multiple generations of humans survive on the spaceship? Not to mention the fact that their oxygen supply would run out sooner or later. Or if something went wrong in the ship, they would probably have to find a way to repair it quickly. There are a ton of questions to be asked, but for now, let's focus on the food. I mean, they planned for 5 years and somehow managed to have a constant supply of food for 700. That's something that people on Earth struggle to deal with, where there are already plants and soil. Imagine doing that in space. Also, where do all the bodies go? Not to get morbid here, even though that's the rabbit hole we are going down in this video, but if they were in space for 700 years, over time the Axiom would have suffered around 2 million casualties just due to time itself. And I know we saw them launching their trash into space, but I don't think any bodies or corpses would have been included in the heap. Even if that was how they got rid of them, I presume it would have been more ceremonial than throwing them into a pile of garbage and then into the cold dark void that is space. So where do all the bodies go? Well, if you pair that question with the fact that not a single person on the Axiom seems to be going through hard times when it comes to food, there might be a pretty dark answer for you. And I'll give you a hint. It doesn't include eating animals, seeing how we never see any livestock on the ship. Instead, what if people were the livestock? I know it's dark, but think about it from a logical and mathematical standpoint. The Axiom is lacking something that is required for humans to survive for generations at a time, which is a surplus of food needed from a very consistent form of a food source. And what they would naturally have a surplus of is corpses from people on board who pass away. It would make sense that the humans could use the surplus of bodies to balance out the food deficit, especially from the perspective of an emotionless robot who is secretly running the whole show behind the scenes. And especially after more and more time has passed on the Axiom, I'm sure the food source would have started to dwindle and eventually have decreased to an amount that is no longer sustainable. And during that time, the number of people on the Axiom who died would have increased from things like aging and other presumable natural deaths. So, what if it was determined that the best way to balance the scales a bit was to decrease the number of corpses on the ship by repurposing them into meals for the people on board of the ship, thus solving their food issues? I know, it seems really dark, but it gets even darker when you start to think about how much the film hinders on the idea of recycling. I think that turning humans into food for other humans would be taking that idea a bit too far though. This means that the people on board the ship would have probably felt the same way, and I doubt any of them would have consciously eaten another human being. This brings up another and equally important idea. The humans didn't know that they were eating their own kind. Think about it. 600,000 people blasted off into space on board the Axiom, all confined to a space that might seem large, but in comparison to the size of the Earth is quite small, meaning that a lot of these people probably got to know each other over time, and their families probably formed relationships that span generations, so it's highly unlikely that they would all just willingly accept the idea of eating their dead friends and family members. So why would anyone on the ship be okay with eating people that they had no choice but to spend time with? They wouldn't if they knew about it, meaning that the only person on board who would know that they are feeding humans to their passengers would be the person that gave the okay in the first place. And they aren't even a person at all, as we mentioned before. Otto was the one who was really in charge, the robot who has no emotions and whose only purpose was to follow Directive A113. And in case you don't recall, Directive A113 was what was preventing Otto from bringing the Axiom back to Earth after 5 years. Otto was programmed with this directive, and it's literally the code that it lives by. Excuse the programmer pun. And as we said, it has no feelings whatsoever, no sympathy towards humans at all. But it also doesn't have any hatred to them either. It is simply keeping them away from Earth and alive in the best way that it knows how. And if that means feeding them their own grandparents without them knowing it, then so be it. Otto is like the honey badger. It doesn't care. Feeding the dead to the passengers on board the ship simply helps Otto fulfill its duty as an emotionless AI program. Which then begs the question, how were the robots on board the Axiom able to feed the passengers human meat without them knowing it? Well, think about how the food was consumed on the ship. The humans were drinking a blended concoction that was presumably full of nutrients and calories needed for them to survive and maintain their marshmallowy figures, and all run from a single corporation called By and Large, which basically monopolized the entire state of existence as well. Meaning we have one corporation for the food source, meaning less variety of food options, you could say. Well, I imagine a serial killer might argue that the best way to disguise the taste and feel of human meat would be to blend it up into some sort of protein drink and sell it through a single corporation that controls all of the food options for the passengers. And I thought protein drinks tasted gross and chalky before. I'll never be able to stomach one of those again after this theory. Now, I mentioned the passengers on the Axiom having marshmallow-like figures, and I'm not trying to come off as insensitive, but that's because of how clearly overweight everyone on the ship seems to be, and it's probably very likely that Otto is feeding the captain of the Axiom false information, because the captain claims that the ship has microgravity, which has caused humans to evolve into having a few fewer bones than they did on Earth. But there are a few problems with that reasoning. One, at the end of the film, the Axiom is shown to have Earth-like gravity when everyone falls to the floor, and two, even if it did have microgravity, that wouldn't inherently make someone overweight. That science doesn't make any sense. And I know, it's a movie, they don't have to follow the science. But they're in space, so most people would assume that there must be some level of science involved there. So what else could cause the entire population to become so overweight? The obvious argument, at least at first glance, would be because of how inactive the people are. As you know, it's gotten to the point that they don't even remember how to walk. But the problem with that is simply the fact that just being lazy, inactive, or just sitting down all day isn't enough to make you obese on its own. In most cases, obesity stems from someone taking in vastly more calories than they expend, meaning that yes, being inactive would be a contributing factor, but only when it's paired with an excessively high calorie intake. And after taking a look at an article written by The Verge that was centered around human meat and how consuming it would affect a person, during the study, they figured out that an entire human body would be the equivalent of consuming 125,000 calories, which is the equivalent of 222 Big Macs. So if the people on the Axiom were eating humans, then they would be theoretically taking in a lot of calories. And the Verge article also mentioned that out of the 125,000 calories, half of them are from adipose tissue, which is essentially fat tissue. Meaning, if the people that lived among the Axiom were consuming slushies made out of their dead, then that would mean they would be able to consume enough fat that when paired with their lack of activity, could potentially cause them to become as obese as we see in the film. And as we said, the people would have no idea the decision to turn the crew into a bunch of oversized floating cannibals would have been one that Otto and the ship made without the consent of the people. But hey, at least in the theory, humanity might be made up of cannibals, but at least it wasn't because they were monsters that were hungry for flesh. Instead, it was because they were too stupid to realize that the AI was controlling every single aspect of their lives, including what, or should I say, who, they consumed. Now, even though we think that this cannibalistic theory could certainly fix the plot hole that is the lack of a sustainable food source in space, we are thankful to a clever Redditor who was able to disprove this theory using our good friend's math. Albeit, the math is a little weird, but nevertheless, it gets the job done. You see, the Redditor did the research and discovered that in the average lifetime of a single human, which is about 67 years, they will have consumed somewhere around 60 million calories. 60,403,850 calories to be exact. And I'm not sure if you could tell, but 60 million calories is a lot more than 125,000 calories that a single human body would provide. So if you do the math, and you take the lifetime total calories consumed, which was around 60 million, and divide by the number of calories provided by the human body, which was approximately approximately 125,000, you would find out that a single person would need to consume 1,208 people in their lifetime. So what does that mean? What do numbers have to do with any of this? Well, numbers are everything when it comes to debunking this theory, because the numbers tell us that roughly every 200 years, the number of passengers on board the Axiom would have to decrease by a factor of 1,208 to compensate for all of the bodies that were consumed over that time period. And if we take into account the fact that there were originally 600,000 passengers on board the Axiom in the year 2105 when it took off into space, there wouldn't have been enough people on board to sustain life for more than 400 years, nowhere near the 700 years that they ended up making it. The math gets even worse when you factor into the equation that every single person on board the Axiom is nowhere near the size of a person would be if they were only consuming the average number of calories. They are clearly taking in more than the normal amount, which would only increase the demand for corpses and lower the passenger count on the ship even faster. In other words, the new math explained to us by the Redditor easily disputes the math used to prove the theory. And let's just say, we are more than thankful for that. I mean, at least now we can still enjoy Wall-E without the dark concept of cannibalism in the back of our minds. I mean, let's face it, Wall-E was already a pretty dark movie about humanity being the bane of its own existence. We didn't need to add another layer to that. But that's just our opinion. What do you guys think? Are there any underlying hints towards the Axiom being a self-sustaining society full of people who don't know they are cannibals? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. As for now, that's all, Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.